1,100 jobs. This leads to unemployment. In 2008, 1 in every 13 jobs disappeared. Unemployment went up by about 100%. That's staggering. And what happened if you had to buy more imports from overseas? That the current account was totally distorted and an economic leakage out of the country running the other way. That cycle keeps on continuing and means that the cultural countries overvalued will never compete. In summary, the uncertainty of the Eurozone aggravates recession and keeps you stuck in it. We understand the reasons why you joined in the first place, but in retrospect, we think it's a horrible mistake. That's why we regret you joining the Eurozone. That's why we beg you to support the opposition.
Speak first against the opposition. I call for Barbara.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank very much the Cambridge team for coming over, and it appears they're in need of a history lesson. We've heard from Richard that Ireland doesn't have control over its interest rates, we don't have control over our monetary policy, and how dreadful this is and all the consequences. Just going back a few years previous, ladies and gentlemen, we've never had an independent monetary policy. A certain country has occupied us for a certain 800 years or so, ladies and gentlemen. There has not been an independent monetary policy. What I want to do is take a look historically first at the role that monetary policy has played in Ireland, kind of very broad brushes. I then want to move on to the crisis and recovery and how the Eurozone is the only thing that's keeping us from the brink. I want to then move on to the counterfactual. What if we weren't in the Euro? I finally want to move on to cooperation and independence and why we think that the Euro is as political as much as an economic issue. But first, the history lesson. Ireland was occupied by the UK until 1922 or so, when there was independence. What we had until then was the sterling. From 1922 onwards, we were at parity with the sterling. We didn't have control of our monetary policy. We never have. We were tied to the Eurozone. No, thank you. Just like in the Students' Union shop up in Front Square there, you could go into a bank and you could change £1 for 1 sterling. It was tied, it was parity, and thank God we continue that tradition in Trinity, just to keep the links back to the old country. But what we say is that there has never been an independent monetary policy. We haven't had that. What we did get brought was famine. What we brought was mass emigration. But we most definitely did not get brought an independent monetary policy. No, thank you. Also, what we had was a very different structure of the economy before '79. What we had was 60% of our exports in the 70s going towards the UK. What we had was an economy that was dependent on Britain for our very economic sovereignty. You had, ladies and gentlemen, if you look back through into the Irish Times in the 50s, you have people questioning the very value of sovereignty when we didn't have economic sovereignty. We had political independence, yes, but we didn't have economic independence. There was nothing along that. That changed, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you, when we joined the EU, and it developed furthermore when we joined into the Euro. What you will see is that from the '79 onwards, again, when we could have maybe had an independent monetary policy, when the law wasn't there that tied us to parity, what we instead had was we kept within the bands of the European monetary system. Again, we didn't have an independent monetary policy. What we did was we stayed within certain bands of the Deutschmark, and when we had to devalue before, ladies and gentlemen, it was because the sterling did. Again, we were not free, no thank you, of our dependence on Britain. What we're saying is that from the European monetary system, there were problems with that. The reunification of Germany showed that unless you have a fiscal policy that is coordinated across countries, you will have problems in the monetary union. What you had was Germany just joining everything together and borrowing loads, and the impacts were on everyone. So that's why we needed the monetary union. That's why countries decided they wanted to move forward. That was one of the major reasons why they moved forward. What we then had the euro, and Richard was very, very right to point out the housing boom. But the point was, that wasn't what led to the housing boom. What led to the housing boom was a demand for housing that was amplified by stupid government policies. Stupid government policies, ladies and gentlemen, that they did in other countries as well. They're implying that the only housing boom happened in Ireland It didn't. UK have their very own housing crisis. America have their very own housing crisis. There are housing crises across the place. No, thank you. It is not just because we joined the Eurozone that we have a housing crisis. We could have nipped that in the bud with fiscal policy, but we didn't. We could have restricted the supply of land, but we didn't. Instead, we gave mortgage supplement to anyone who wanted to go off and buy a house. We inflated. We stoked those flames until they were burning. So what we say then is that we have never had that independent monetary policy that they talk about. No, thank you. We didn't have that to lose. What they had, we had been tied to Britain for that. And by going into the euro, and we'll be developing this further throughout our team, what really joining the EU and also the euro brought to us was real economic independence. Instead of having no say in what was decided in London, what we had is a seat at the board in Germany. What we had is finally a say in the monetary policy that was being pursued. We had never had that before. All we had was it being dictated from London. So moving on to the crisis and the recovery and what are the prospects for this. Looking first at our debt. Ireland has an extraordinary amount of debt denominated in euro. If we were outside of the euro, and it was borrowed from Germany, borrowed from the Eurozone countries, if we hadn't have been in the Eurozone, ladies and gentlemen, we would have still done this borrowing because that's where we would have got the money from. But what we would have had now is if we devalue the currency, that debt would shoot up. What they are talking about by Ireland not being in the Eurozone is in essence default. What they are saying is that we should be doing, if we weren't there, is devaluing the currency and defaulting on the debt. If you look at Latvia at the moment, who are not in the Eurozone, but they have been pegged to, they are being recommended by the IMF and the European Union and all our neighbours to stay pegged to the Eurozone and to do it the hard way, the way we're doing it. There's only 2 countries who are attempting to do a real devaluation, that is reducing costs to restore competitiveness, reducing cost of labour, reducing cost of electricity and all the rest of it. And we're the only 2 attempting that real way, and we're doing it well. We're ahead of the curve. Britain haven't even started dealing with their problems. They haven't even started. They're holding off until after the election next year because it's too politically hard. What Ireland has shown is that you can address the issues, you can do it, we're moving towards there, and that this can be done without monetary policy. Monetary policy is not needed for this. Looking at the banking crisis, ladies and gentlemen, the ECB is the only thing keeping the Irish banks afloat. There's recently been a statement released showing the emergency liquidity provision that the European Central Bank brought out. Of that, Ireland have taken 60 billion. Germany has taken 28.5 billion. As a percentage of our GDP, we've got 36% come in and keeping those banks afloat. Germany, 1.2%, ladies and gentlemen. The ECB, once again, is the only thing keeping those banks there. If we weren't in the Eurozone, ladies and gentlemen, that liquidity wouldn't be there, and our banking crisis, all our banks would be insolvent. It would be a far lot worse. It's bad now, but it would be much worse if it wasn't for the Eurozone. On borrowing, ladies and gentlemen, what we saw again from our experience when we were in the EMS was that there was a risk premium attached to borrowing in Irish punt, because there always was the risk that we would devalue. There's the possibility that we default. That is not there with the Eurozone, ladies and gentlemen. That has been reduced substantially. It has been estimated that that premium was about 1 to 2%, nearer the 2% side. And that if that hadn't have been there, that we would have had an we would have had the Celtic Tiber come earlier. That what we saw was a capital wedge emerge where the cost of capital was too high because of the risk premium that was being applied to Irish borrowing internally. What we are seeing is that regaining competitiveness, that costs can come down in real devaluation. Latvia have slashed their public sector pay bill by 25%, and Ireland is doing likewise, or 10, 12 days. What we are showing is that you can achieve what you need through fiscal policy, and the monetary policy, the risks of those are gone.
In 2000, the real interest rates in Ireland, because of the Eurozone, were essentially 0. When inflation was so high, would it not have been a good thing for interest rates to be higher so that people wouldn't have expanded in a ridiculous way like they did?
And now, if we had control of, if we were outside the Eurozone, the interest rates would be far, far greater than, they'd be up 4 or 5%. And that is a huge problem, because at the moment there already isn't enough lending. If you had higher interest rates now, it would be stifling any chance of recovery that we have. By being in the Eurozone, yes, the low interest rates were for housing, they encourage it. But that can be tackled with fiscal policy. That's the point that we're making. It can clearly be tackled by fiscal policy, and just because we didn't doesn't mean it can't be done. We should have. Moving on to the counterfactual, if we weren't in the euro, what would we have? Along with a banking and a fiscal crisis, what we'd have would be a currency crisis. The Irish government not only would have to be taking out money to plug the fiscal debt, not only would we be having to borrow money to solve the banking crisis, but we'd have to be borrowing every day ridiculous amounts to stop currency speculators bringing down the Irish currency and forcing us to devalue. What we would be seeing would be throwing a monetary crisis into the mix. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is something that Ireland most definitely could not survive. To summarise, ladies and gentlemen, what we on this side of the House are saying is that loss of monetary policy isn't a new thing for Ireland. It's been the way that we've operated for hundreds of years. What we're saying is that Ireland instead sees the benefits that can come from cooperation. The European Union and the Eurozone gave us a way of breaking free from the United Kingdom. For a share of exports, I think it's interesting to look at. In the 1970s, as I said, was 60% to the UK. That's now declined to 20%, ladies and gentlemen. For the EU, it's gone from 20% up to 50%. We have changed where we want to be in the world. And as part of that, and Kieran will be building this, as part of that, the Eurozone is necessary for that. It's necessary for the foreign direct investment, and it's necessary for that. Ladies and gentlemen, I move to oppose.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Wasn't it a pleasure to hear Richard Lau, an Englishman from Cambridge, finally talking over and over again about your country, your economy? Well, it was until we heard the first opposition speech, which was, well, you know, we never really had control over our fiscal policy, therefore, why would we want it now? Like, you had the whole 800-year thing. Two responses to that. First of all, like, my history isn't that good, but from what I can remember, nobody over here was too happy about the 800-year thing, right? Second of all, like this, like, we were dependent on the UK. Like, let's pretend that that's true, because it isn't. Like, that was bad, but that's reflective of having massive trade links as a vestige of the imperialism. It's not something that was imperialism in and of itself. He says it's really, really good that trade has gone down. Like, we don't think the fact that you were selling lots of Dell laptops to the UK was something that was particularly imperialistic. If anything, it's something that's quite useful because you have low transaction costs when you're selling to the UK rather than the EU, much easier to import. I've got two arguments. First of all, I'm going to talk about the pernicious nature of deficit caps. Second of all, I'm going to talk about political sovereignty and accountability. Might get to that, don't know, it's largely rhetoric anyway. First of all, lots of rebuttal. Okay, first of all, like, in response to the housing boom, we got this idea that, like, oh, well, it was just stupid policies, so that's okay. No, the point is that you cannot recover easily if you can't adjust your interest rates. If you have divested control over your ability to control your economy, that means you are no longer able to foster the political capital in order to be able to change that. You have to do it through the ECB, through institutions that aren't accountable to the Irish public, aren't sensitive to those kinds of problems, are more sensitive to the problems going on in the bigger countries, the countries with more political clout within the European Union, countries like France and Germany. Ireland hasn't got that amount of say. Then we heard, like, well, we can finally have a say because we can finally, like, have our say in Europe rather than in the UK. Right? Completely false dichotomy. First of all, we think that by and large Ireland is often ignored in EU discussions when instead it's the big four that get to generate policies. Second of all, we think there is a third way, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. We think the third way is that Ireland could control its own policies. We haven't heard a response as to why that's not true. We just heard, well, it never was. One more thing, no thank you. Like, this idea that, like, the ECB is keeping Ireland afloat. Like, we don't think that the ECB would decide to let an economy within Europe fail. We think it's probably likely that if Ireland was in dire trouble, as other countries have been in dire trouble, the ECB might be able to intervene in those circumstances to protect them. And this idea that, like, well, like, we think Britain has effectively devalued its currency, Mr. Speaker, because it's floated it, which hasn't been able to happen with the euro. Right. 2 points. First of all, pernicious nature of deficit caps. Well, we think that it's really problematic that the euro imposes a deficit cap of 3%. It's problematic that the European Commission can force countries and take action against those countries within Europe and exert pressure against them when they're trying to mobilize capital in order to save their economies. We think that that's something that's problematic. There are 2 consequences on this. First of all, you can't stimulate your economy. That's problematic in situations like we have at the moment. Richard tells me there's a recession going on. We think in that circumstance, you want a Keynesian stimulus. And that's not like that, that's not just jargon. That's about having, that's about, and I'll take you in a moment, sir, that's about having money in order to be able to stimulate your industry, about being able to make sure that you can get jobs, about being able to make sure that the industry stay afloat. That means that other people are able to buy things. We think that that's something that's important. Go.
Give me a small country in a similar place to Ireland that is in a position to spend 15% of its GDP as a fiscal stimulus. No other institution would give us the ability to do that, but our membership of the Eurozone allows us to get away with that.
Right, like, as I've said, I think it's likely that the European Union doesn't want its countries to fail, to fall into anarchy, to fall into the states of nature, because its economy isn't doing too well. We think it's fairly likely... Hello. Sit down. Right, like, when there's a recession, when there's a recession, you spend less. That means wages go down. That means you start losing jobs. You get a downward spiral. We think that that's something that's problematic unless you are able to pump prime the economy, unless the government is able to break that paradox of thrift. We think that that's something that's problematic when the government can't do that because it hasn't got any money, because it can't borrow it. The reason it can't borrow it is because there's a European cap on it being able to do so. That's something that's extremely problematic because it can never break that cap when it's a country like Ireland, although we do notice coincidentally that France and Germany and Italy are allowed to get away with those things a little bit more because they're the big countries. We think that that's something that's particularly problematic because it means that Ireland can't get itself out of a recession that has been even more pernicious towards it than it has towards other things. We think that Ireland is specifically different to those countries that don't necessarily need to borrow. Why is that? Several reasons. First of all, because we think it's powered by niche elements of the economy. We think that where those industries are failing, those need shoring up. We think that's not the same in countries like Germany. We think that, second of all, there is the propensity to get into consumer debt, more like the UK than in other European countries. We think that means that you need fiscal stimulus much more. You need to try and help your economy much more because the prospects of failure are far more pernicious than they are in other things. Richard told you about the culture of house buying. That is extremely problematic when you have a house that is in a downward spiral. When house prices are falling and you are trapped in negative equity, we think that that's something that means you can no longer move. That's a problem in and of itself for people, but it's also a problem because it means that that labour is no longer mobile. It can't move to where there are jobs within the European Union because it's trapped in its house. We think that that's something that's problematic. Thirdly, we think that Ireland is fundamentally at different stages of development to other countries within the European Union. Yes, we accept that might have had something to do with the whole 800-year thing, but we think that it doesn't mean that Ireland isn't different. We think it's in a different trade cycle and therefore is vulnerable to asymmetric shocks. That's something that the EU can't then deal with. The second problem within this is it means that because you have a budget cap, you have to budget for austerity. It means that you can't give things like tax breaks to people who need it. It means that you can't invest in things like education, can't invest in things like healthcare that you might otherwise want to do. Don't know about the Irish healthcare system. I'll take you in a moment. We think in that circumstance you are unable to be able to get your economy out of recession in the first place, and second of all, ensure that it never goes into recession by making sure you have the kind of skilled people by investing in education that you would need. Tell me why that's not true.
I'm wondering, you say there's a cap on how much we can borrow, being 3% in this Building Growth Pact. How exactly are we allowed to borrow 15% if the EU is so evil and stopping us doing this?
Right, okay. The thing is, you have broken the rules, which is why the European Commission is taking action against Ireland. We think that's why Ireland is going to be the subject of fines. That's why it's the subject of litigation. That's why governments are trying to reduce budgets. We think that that's something that's problematic for coping with this recession and also coping with recessions in the future. Second of all, we think that there is a problem with political sovereignty, right? Like, the thing with economics is it's always tried to be separated from things like morality, things from politics, but it's fundamentally not. It's a completely political issue. Whether or not you raise interest rates impacts on ordinary people in exactly the same way as any other kind of political policy does. When you join the European Union, when you join the Euro, you delegate that to the will of a technocrat who cares more about the beck and call of its political masters in Frankfurt and in Brussels than it does about the ordinary person in Ireland. We think that that's something that's problematic. The long-term loyalty is furtherance to an integrationist project rather than to caring and alleviating the problems of recession in one part of one country. We think these people are fundamentally not accountable to their people. The reason why we have a democracy in every country in the European Union is to ensure that that kind of accountability exists, to ensure that people get a say. You don't get that when you delegate that to something like the ECB that is removed from ordinary people. You don't get it when Ireland has such a small political say, and that's why we beg to move.
Now to speak against the opposition, Kieran Hall.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society and of the Student Economic Review, good evening. So, twice Cambridge have told us that the answer to the problems of the Irish economy, which they say are caused by membership of the euro, is to devalue. I'm going to try and show you why the answer isn't to devalue and why even having the option of devaluation, which we would as a small country outside of the euro, is in of itself dangerous. Now, when we joined the euro, we saw a whole pile of benefits and we accepted that there were a couple of costs. We accepted that we weren't going to be able to determine a few things for ourselves. It's the same kind of thing that happens when the Cornish County Council decides they're going to accept the pound sterling. You accept that you are into a larger thing with benefits, and you accept that you're not going to be able to do what's best, you're not going to be able to take certain policies for local areas. So what is wrong at the moment in Ireland? Well, we're having economic problems. And where did they come from? Well, they came from, in terms of, banks, and they're not being, the banks having their own kind of culture, and they're not being sufficient regulation, things like that. Thank you. And so you talk about why there was lots of lending. It was, a global problem in the UK, in the US. But also because of housing, and because housing became so strongly, and because, you say it's all to do about interest rates, or at least that was an element. Well, maybe it was a small element. But when, in 2000, we're told, why in 2000 was it right for interest rates to be so low? Well, was it right at about that time for the Irish government to artificially extend the housing boom? No, it wasn't. When you're having kind of 18% growth in house prices, the tiny extra adage coming from interest rates doesn't bother me all that much, because it's such a small part of it. What it's been like for Ireland over the last while is it's been like going out on the lash and getting really languid, and it was good fun. But then we woke up. And what was the ECB? Well, they were like our mom, telling us to cop on to ourselves, which they did. They tried to convince us to take more reasonable action, but now what they're doing is they're telling us it's okay. They're making us a big dirty fry, and they're ringing our school and telling them we have the flu. Because what the EU is doing is that they are allowing us to borrow far, far more than the cap which we're told that we have. And we're told that now they're taking action against Ireland. In fact, they're allowing us to take that money and to have that money when we need it, and then they're setting in place a programme which we can use to come back from deficit afterwards. I don't like this idea that a country should always be in deficit, and when the EU helps us to come out of it, that's good. So now we have a new choice, and that new choice is between structural reform, which is going to be difficult, no thank you, changing the economy, changing costs in the economy, changing wages, or devaluation, which is a bit like just opening another can. What it'll do is it'll take away the headache for a while, but I suggest it's not a good idea. So why isn't devaluation the answer? Well, first off, I question how helpful it would be, seeing as it's designed to help exports, and interestingly, Irish exports haven't really dropped that much. The problem in terms of the Irish economy has been internal demand in terms of the housing market. Exports aren't that bad, so we wouldn't help it. But it's actually dangerous and bad for us, because it means that we're going to have higher insurance. What it means is that it opens us up to something that's called speculative attack. When currency traders see a small country which is devaluing its currency, then they take actions which make sense for them, but which screw the country into the ground. This is the kind of thing that happened to countries like Iceland. It hasn't happened to Ireland because we're in such a big currency, and it can't happen to us. So what do we need if we don't need that kind of thing? Well, what we need to do is bring in confidence. And why is confidence relevant? Well, if you're devaluing, and you say devaluing is the answer, it's a short-term fix. Maybe even if exports were the problem, it would be a short-term fix. But it wouldn't last. You'd have to do it again. We suggest it's not a good idea to be constantly devaluing your currency forever. In the same way, it's not a good idea to be drunk for the rest of your life. Because if you do that, people don't trust you. People aren't going to employ you. And they're not going to invest in your country. We need that. Well, the thing about Ireland is that its economic strength, what it still has of it, comes from trade in Europe. An ever-growing proportion of Ireland's trade is in the Eurozone. Well, we're told it's not a bad thing that we were selling Dell computers to Britain, and it wasn't. But the fact that now we're in the Euro, and that is our major market, we're selling more computers than ever we did. And it's by sticking to that market that we can boost our economy at the moment. Yes, sir?
So when Dell pulled out of Limerick, leading to 1,100 job losses, what happened there?
Well, that wasn't great.
No, it wasn't.
However, I'm not sure, when you've got an issue where there's global economic downturn, you can blame the movement of a company's offices on the currency policy of the country that's in. In any case, Irish wages are very high. If we just lower the wages, that would deal with the problem. And that's the thing. That's what structural reform is. It's an actual answer. Because the thing is that, when we were having a great time, costs and wages went up. The wages weren't all that helpful because everything was so expensive we couldn't buy that much more. But the costs are so high, no thank you, that companies don't have a reason to invest here. And other European countries are looking at Ireland and they're astonished at the fact that we are able to do things like have about a 7% drop in public sector wages. Because we're able to take those actions, and we're taking those actions. We don't need to have devaluation as a tool, madam.
But some might say you were wanting to devalue wages. Surely this is just really bad because then people have less money and the stuff is still really expensive. By devaluing the whole currency, then at least people can afford stuff. Surely that's loads better.
All right, here's the thing. That's another element of the whole thing. If we look at Ireland at the moment, we look at things like people going across the border to Newry to buy things. The thing is, Newry in the UK has been cheaper than Ireland for a long time because Irish retailers haven't been competitive. They haven't bothered to lower their costs to the point where they could. Now, we're at a stage where if the government, as opposed to simply devaluing, takes structural policies, takes policies which deal with costs, then retailers have an incentive to do that. Quality of life can be maintained because costs of products can go down and costs to investing countries can go down. And why do those countries invest in Ireland? What is it about Ireland that's so attractive at the moment? Well, just note that most of what we're selling is being made by companies that are investing from abroad. And they're coming here because we're able to sell so well in Europe. We're able to sell so well in Europe. We're viewed as a gateway, partly, in fact, to a large extent, because we're part of the euro. No, thank you. When you're part of the same currency as other countries, then you have confidence that deals can go ahead, you can predict things, and trade is just easier. Foreign companies want to be part of that in Ireland. The euro makes us safe from the dangers of being a small country with your own currency, which other people don't trust you not to devalue. It makes us an attractive investment option. But what it denies us is an illusory quick fix. We are richer and more secure in the euro, and we should all be glad that we made that decision.
Invite speakers in the front more to put their names forward if they're interested in speaking after the plenary. We still have another 2 spaces on opposition and opposition. Third. Okay. I call upon Mary Newton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do 3 things for you today. I'm going to take you through a kind of history of the Eurozone. I'm going to talk first about the bad stuff the Eurozone's done. I'm going to secondly talk about why we think to get out of the Eurozone at this point in time, we don't think how to get out of the recession, the Eurozone is not helping. And thirdly, I want to talk about why in the future, because of the nature of the Eurozone and the nature of the Irish economy, we're always going to have problems with being in the Eurozone in Ireland. And then I'm also going to talk about a kind of overarching idea which spans all these time periods and talk about political sovereignty. But firstly, a few pieces of rhetoric from the last speaker's speech. So he first said at the right hand side of the speech that when we joined the Eurozone, we knew there were a pile of benefits, and even if there were a few costs, this pile of benefits was great. The thing is, though, ladies and gentlemen, the opposition has yet to tell us any of these pile of benefits, right? There's all these really great things that come with the Eurozone. We're not really sure exactly what they are. We'd quite like the last speaker to tell us what this pile of benefits are. That means all these costs, they've conceded there are lots of costs involved that are okay. My second point, he was like, oh yeah, interest rate, they were just a tiny part of the housing boom, and it was just all the government's fault. We say, firstly, even if there were other factors affected, which is what Richard accepted from the start, there were other factors affecting the housing boom. I think the point that it was ridiculously cheap to buy stuff, even though inflation was really high, necessarily means it was a massive part of it. Like, he just was like, oh, it's a tiny part. We think that's absolutely wrong. Like, we think if we look at the comparisons in countries, including Ireland, where the interest rates are high, interest rates are low, and the amount people buy houses, there's a massive correlation. Like, it's entirely connected. He can't pretend it's not. Thirdly, he kind of painted this picture as the EU as a saviour. Now, how did he say it was a saviour? He said, firstly, they're letting us exceed our cap. The first response to this is, well, isn't that really kind of them? Like, why? We don't think it's necessarily true that they're like letting us exceed the cap that they've set on us is particularly like a kind thing for them to do. We think actually, like the proposition we've been telling you all along, countries should have control over their own decisions about how much they can borrow at particular times. But further we say, he was like, yeah, they've been allowed to borrow 15% and that's great. The point is that, ladies and gentlemen, the EU Commission at the moment is stopping them to do that. They've said in 2013 you have to reduce that deficit, no thank you, to such a low enough level that if Ireland's still in an economic problem, it's going to face loads of fines. But further, even if all of those institutional checks weren't true, so the political pressure involved is really important, and that means Ireland's very limited in what it can do. Why is this the case? Well, we see it's the case that if Ireland increases its deficit by borrowing more and increases the devaluation of the currency, this affects the whole of the Eurozone, because essentially everything becomes worth less. As a result, everyone in the Eurozone has an interest in whether or not Ireland increases its deficit. Therefore, it's very hard for Ireland to turn around and say, we're going to screw you over because we want to just pump more money into our economy. Because we say economies, especially when there's some kind of recession, should be selfish and should be able to decide what's best for its country and not what all these kind of other political interests that are involved. No, thank you. And then next he was like, well, the big good thing about the Eurozone, this one benefit he did give us, was that there's a risk of defaulting if you're a small country, and that's really bad because people might speculate on the currency. We say a number of things. Their response to any kind of problem involving interest rates has been like, we'll use fiscal policy to stop this problem. So we're going to say the same thing, ladies and gentlemen. We'll use fiscal policy to stop this happening. Like, right back at you. I mean, I'm sorry. The next point, ladies and gentlemen, is about devaluation. And this was his big point in the last speaker. He was like, devaluation's really bad. Firstly, we say, even if that's true, and we don't accept this true, and I'll tell you why in a second, even if that's true, the point of the proposition is not that we think devaluation is the answer to all the problems. The point of the proposition is that the hands of Ireland are tied, and even if it wanted to, even if it decides that devaluation is the right thing to do, it can't, because it does not have that capability. But why, no thank you, was the rest of the analysis wrong, even if you don't accept that principle? And actually, devaluation is a very important tool in a fiscal policy kind of way. We say, firstly, he was like, yeah, well, no one else has devalued their currency, and even when they do, it just screws them over. That's not true. Both the UK and the USA have effectively devalued their currency by being able to float their exchange rate on their currency on the market. We further saw, as Richard told you, in the late 90s when there was an Asian crash, that's what they did. They devalued their currency to make them more competitive, and that meant that they could rise out of their problems. No, thank you. And then he was like, exports, that's not the problem. So then he just ignored Richard's point of information about how Dell's just moved away. We say exports are the big problem. The way of getting out of recession is becoming an export economy again. That can't happen when everything's way too expensive. And the last thing he said was like, I know, we'll solve this problem of devaluation. Instead of doing that, we'll just lower people's wages, right? Firstly, that's probably devaluation in and of itself. But secondly, as I said in my point of information, if people are earning less, but the stuff is still really expensive, that's really problematic, ladies and gentlemen. That means people can't afford to live. Like, we're not just talking about this kind of big monster of an economy which is devalued. We're talking about actual people who are now earning less money under the opposition's case, no thank you, and still having less money. So, firstly, this question is the bad stuff the Eurozone's done. I've covered some of it in my already, but we say the point at which Europe, the rest of the Europe was kind of plodding along in its own kind of already developed way, and Ireland was on the up. That's the point at which inflation was really high in Ireland, but not in the rest of Europe. Now, because Ireland's such a small country and only one of 16 in the Eurozone, no thank you, there was no way that the rest of Europe was going to be like, well, just because Ireland's like on the way up, we should probably increase interest rates to stop there's some kind of crazy housing boom like this is what happened. Now, the problem with that is, ladies and gentlemen, is the problem we've heard all down the proposition about the housing bubble, lots of debt. Now, let's look secondly now about the stimulation of the economy and how it can happen now. Now, the point at the moment, the problem with the euro is it's really, really expensive in Ireland. I'm going to use an example, ladies and gentlemen. In England, what you call Milano is called Pizza Express, right? So it's the same restaurant, exactly the same pizzas, just in different names, different prices, right? Now, basically, when I change my money to come to Ireland, I get like about £1 to £1. It's essentially the same. But the same pizza in England is about £8. The same pizza in Ireland, no thank you, is about €12. Now, this is just extent to me wanting to have cheap enough food when I come to Ireland, ladies and gentlemen. Let's imagine that I'm like a pizza importer. I have a choice between importing pizza from England from Pizza Express when it's like £8, or for basically the same price importing a £12 pizza from Ireland. Now, why would I ever choose to import from Ireland? Clearly, the answer is I'm going to import from England or any other similar country where stuff isn't so expensive. So the problem here about stimulating the economy is that no one's going to buy stuff that's really, really expensive when there's lots of other alternatives. So competitiveness just can't happen. We need to be an export economy to be able to increase our economy. Then the second problem about stimulating the economy is the deficit caps, which we've talked about. Now, even if you accept all our analysis that the EU's been really kind in letting us borrow what we think we need to borrow in Ireland, no thank you. We say the point is about political pressure, is that's not really possible. That they have to engage in lots of political action to make sure this can happen. That's really problematic, and we think that's really bad. So thirdly, let's look about the future. And what we think it's not just at the moment, and this particular problem we see at the moment, where the Eurozone is problematic, but systematically, Ireland is not suited to being part of such a big union which has so much variation. So the first issue here is trade. So these guys were like, yeah, Europe's like the place to trade, like that's where all our trade happens. We say, firstly, that's not true. More than 50% of trade with Europe, with Ireland, is either in pounds or in dollars, right? So the vast majority. Now, given there's obviously lots of Asian trade too, the portion of Ireland has to be the euro has to be quite small. We say, we're not exactly sure why intrinsically European trade is better than that. They've just asserted that it's much better that we engage in European trade. We're not exactly sure why. We think actually, look, like lots of Asian markets are probably quite good too. We think like the current trade that Ireland has with the UK and USA is also great. We say further though, there's a different economy to Europe. Because of the way that Ireland's developed at a different point, necessarily, the points at which Ireland needs stimuluses like interest rates to change, that kind of stuff that happens on a European level, is going to be a different point to the point at which other countries in Europe are going to want it. We think it's going to systematically be the case that like we saw in 2000 where inflation was really high but interest rates were ridiculously low, that's going to continue to happen, I'll take you in a second, and that's going to continue to happen in the future because of the nature of the economy. Go on.
One of the interesting things about a common currency is that economies, patterns converge. All the time, Europe becomes a larger part of our trade, and it's a good trading partner because it's solid, because it's cheaper, because of all the benefits of being in the same currency. So
basically his argument here is that if we wait long enough, Ireland's going to get similar enough to the rest of Europe, and it'll be fine. We say, firstly, there's lots of really awful costs involved in the meantime, right? Like Keynes said, everyone dies before that's going to happen, right? There's no point in being like, oh, we wait 50 years, we'll be like the rest of Europe. We've not really had a reason from the opposition why Europe's the right person we should try to be like. We think actually, if at the moment we can find ourselves similar to other economies like the UK, that's much better. So why is Ireland significantly different to other economies? So actually it's a service sector. It's a similar kind of economy to places like the UK, where there's lots of niche elements of things like technology industries and pharmaceutical companies, rather than big industrial heartlands like you find in places like Germany. That's really important to the ways in which different factors of the global economy affect the Irish economy. The factors that affect the Irish economy in a really bad way won't necessarily affect the rest of Europe in a really bad way. That means interest rates won't be catered to the right kind of things in Ireland. We say we say it's different in a systematic way that means it will happen continually. The last point I turn to is briefly about political sovereignty. The problem with giving a big amount of your control away to Europe is there's no real accountability. Right? The point at which it's the government, in some sense, that's actually engaging in the interest rates and monetary policy is the point at which when the people don't like it and are unimpressed with the way a situation is being dealt with, they can be voted out. That's not really the case when you're stuck in the Eurozone, when you can't leave and you can't make decisions. The decisions are far away, and like Jack said, they're about like the idea of institutionalized nationalisation and like further integration rather than actually what's best for the people of Ireland at this point in time. We say that's really problematic. We further say that political union needs to be much more in line with the economic union for it to be good. Ladies and gentlemen, Ireland as only one of 16 countries in the Eurozone. Say the point at which it's such a small country and has such little power, we don't think its hands should be tied by the rest of Europe. We'd like to hear what these pile of benefits are. I urge you to propose.
And now the third speaker against the motion, I call on Jamie. Ambassadora Narita Ainton Nabrata Namora Gasushka Darren. You liked that, didn't you? Mr. Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, before I begin, I want to issue a warning that should have been issued to this country 850 years ago. Beware of English people coming over here, painting a pretty picture and giving us an easy solution. They fooled Diarmuid McMurrough, ladies and gentlemen. Don't let yourselves fall into that same trap tonight. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, having listened to Mr. Lau especially speak, I'm convinced that he should leave his business card in with Mr. Cowan in government buildings. He painted a very selective picture of the fact that, our government had nothing to do with the last 10 years and that it's all down to the European Central Bank. And failing that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure Mr. Brown will very enthusiastically embrace his services as the next dark prince of the Labour Party following in the footsteps of Mr. Mandelson. Ladies and gentlemen, they've asked us what are the benefits, and I'll get to those in a few minutes. I'm going to do an awful lot of things today. I'm going to deal with an awful lot of the hyperbole and empty rhetoric we've heard tonight. They sounded like sociologists at one stage, ladies and gentlemen. All theory, no facts. They haven't given us one figure. We said, no, sit down. We said, oh, it's nice to get your own back, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to get your own back. We said, ladies and gentlemen, that our exports have proved resilient, and they have. The exports from Sweden have been reduced. Sit down, listen to these facts. Exports from Sweden have reduced 25%. Exports across the Eurozone have reduced by 35%. In Ireland, our exports have proved particularly resilient. They have only fallen by 5%. They don't get it, ladies and gentlemen. The reason that American companies establish themselves in this country is because we have the euro. Because they realise, no thank you, that we're English speaking, that we assets and benefits in this country that other countries don't have. And what they didn't do, ladies and gentlemen, they painted a picture that if Ireland walked out of the euro now, ceteris paribus, yes, the only economic term you're going to hear tonight, sit down. If Ireland walked out of the Eurozone tomorrow, ceteris paribus, that we'd be able to do all these wonderful things, like pull the magic devaluational wand out of our pockets, wave it over Ireland, and hey presto, the houses have gone away, the interest rates are particularly low for some reason, and Ireland is booming again. Sit down. But what they failed to do, ladies and gentlemen, is look at a country that was in this position. A country that wasn't in the Eurozone, that is in this situation now, like Latvia, ladies and gentlemen, that had exactly the same problems as we had, that had cheap credit, that had governments that were very good at getting re-elected, but very bad at managing economies. Sit down. What they failed to do, ladies and gentlemen, is look at what's happened to Latvia now. They've cut their public sector wages by 25%. In fact, the one thing that the IMF have told the Latvian government not to do is to devalue their currency. What have they told them to do, ladies and gentlemen? To join the euro. Because, like the film The Mighty Ducks, ladies and gentlemen, small countries, ducks fly together, small countries fly together under a eurozone. Please.
So firstly, so Latvia is tied to the euro, so that's a moot point anyway. But secondly, more importantly, how do you explain a 100% increase in unemployment if exports haven't been affected?
Okay, listen to this, ladies and gentlemen. This is the part I love. I love this line about central banks being accountable. Now, I'm doing political science, and granted, it's probably not that useful. But one of the things we do learn about, ladies and gentlemen, that the symbol of an independent liberal democracy is that the central bank shouldn't be accountable to the people. That it shouldn't be independent. Imagine the election posters, ladies and gentlemen. Mervyn King, there is a better way. Ben Bernanke, yes, we can't. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, the power that our central bankers would have if they were accountable to the public. That's the last thing you do with economies. You don't involve people in those decisions. That's why central banks need to be independent. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, with these wonderful tools of monetary policy that our neighbours in the United Kingdom have had, that they managed to make as much of a mess as we did of our economy. And what's more, ladies and gentlemen, sit down. And what's more, ladies and gentlemen, is at least we've had the good grace to admit we were wrong, and we've started cutting our costs. That in this country, the only country in the European Union, that there's been a 4% fall in unit labour costs. Totally opposite to the other 26 member states. They'll probably say that's a lie as well. I invite you to check it out. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, more importantly, sit down. This is good. More importantly, ladies and gentlemen, what they fail to realise is that the British government probably won't do anything about their deficit until after the general election, which, you know, is what would probably happen if central banks were elected, that they probably wouldn't change interest rates or do anything about interest rates until after the election. So that kills this great idea they have about the necessity for accountable central banks. No, thank you, Richard. So this kind of idea then, we looked at Denmark and Sweden. Two other countries, they're okay, the countries of blonde bombshells and wealthy welfare states, ladies and gentlemen, they're doing okay. We'd think and we'd say, they've got independent monetary policy, they're doing fine, we want to be like them. No, they're not, ladies and gentlemen. They peg their currency to the euro. When the European Central Bank makes a decision about interest rates, they follow it immediately. When the euro is affected on the exchange rate market, ladies and gentlemen, what happens 3 hours later in Copenhagen and Stockholm? It's all right, I'll answer for you. They change their rate to correspond to that rate. They want to get in. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, a study in Sweden found that it will make great economic sense for the Swedish people to enter the Eurozone because they wouldn't lose all that monetary control, because their monetary policy, by virtue of the fact that they're members of the Eurozone, is defined by the rates set by the ECB. No, thank you. I want to get on to these. Apparently we didn't give them benefits, ladies and gentlemen. This I love. I love this fallacy that we've been thrown out about, that there's no benefits to joining the Eurozone, right? One is Iceland. I don't need to say anything else about that. That's pretty obvious, okay? No, thank you. Sit down. If you jump any more, you'll break your spine. So, on the Iceland question, ladies and gentlemen, the IMF went in, they told them what they had to do, and they've had to do it. And what are they chomping at the bit to do, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, I hear you say it, join the euro. The same thing that the IMF told Latvia to do, sit down. The same thing, ladies and gentlemen, that Denmark and Sweden want to do. So they gave us this idea of devaluation works, but they failed to incorporate that in Italy they tried that for years. And what happened? They devalued, and they devalued again, but the trade unions, they got clever, ladies and gentlemen, and they realised that their members were losing worse than their wages. In this country, we're honest about screwing over our public sector union workers. We'll say it to their face, and then we'll cut their wages or their unpaid leave. So, ladies and gentlemen, this doesn't work. We tried devaluation in the 80s, and if you've read any economic history of Ireland, as it's obvious the Cambridge team haven't, sit down, you'll find that the 80s wasn't a particularly nice time in this country economically. Sit down. And then we get to this point about competitiveness. And this I love, because the reason that Ireland hasn't, the reason that Ireland hasn't done well over the last 10 years, which is news to me because last time I checked, in 1992 we were at 60% of the European Union average income per household, sit down, but in 2006 we were at 130% of the European Union average. Now, I'm sorry, maths was never my strong point. That's definitely twice as high. We did well out of European Union membership. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Because we had the euro. For us, it isn't about devaluing a currency. They asked, ladies and gentlemen, that a deficit cap, the deficit cap that has been put on our government from borrowing. As if the international markets wouldn't put a deficit cap on the amount of money we'll borrow. They fail to forget that unlike Her Majesty's Britannic Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, we are a small but proud nation of 4.5 million people. They're 60 million. Yes, if they want to indebt themselves till the cows come home, that's their business. We can't afford to do that. But we are in a position where we can borrow 15% of GDP. 1 second, Richard. We can borrow 15% of GDP, and we can say that we are in a position to borrow it. Yes, please.
Mary told you in a point of information that your unemployment is going up by 100%. You then ignored that point of information and went ballistic.
Okay.
You answered the point of information.
Okay. Let's deal with this little gem. And gems they are indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Let's look at a few of the figures from the Irish economy at the moment in relation to export. In 1973, when we entered the Europe, I'm going to answer it. They refused to accept the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that our exports, unlike theirs, are pretty resilient. In 1973, we weren't exporting all that much. 23% of our gross national income was defined by what we were exporting. In 2009, 93% of our gross national income is defined by what we are exporting. We're good at exporting. It's what we do well. The problem was, ladies and gentlemen, that our domestic demand got so high because we were selling goods and services to each other all the time. I've got an awful lot more things to say, ladies and gentlemen, but one more thing on competitiveness. They claim that our competitiveness has been eroded because of the rate of sterling and the exchange rate. Yes, this country has lost 25% of its competitiveness in the last 10 years. We don't dispute that. A third of that was because of the exchange rate in sterling. 2/3 of that was because of high labour costs, paying ourselves too much money for work and services that the rest of the world wasn't happy to pay that price for, ladies and gentlemen. They compared the UK and Ireland, and Mary told us all about the free pizzas over in the UK. The guy who makes those pizzas over in the UK probably gets paid in real terms, not nominal terms, in real terms, a hell of a lot less than the guy who makes them over in Ireland. Ladies and gentlemen, recently I've had the pleasure of making an acquaintance with a chap from the United Kingdom, and he thought it would be a good idea for him to read the history of his host country. And he was telling us about his experiences, about what he was reading the other night, and he said for one reason or another he had stopped reading. And we asked him, where did you stop reading? He said 1916. And we asked him, why did you stop reading in 1916? That's where it got good. Because, ladies and gentlemen, that is where it got good. That's where a small nation stood up and said, no more. We will shape our own destiny. We will go forward. If we want to pool our sovereignty rather than tie it to someone else, we will make that decision. This far and no further, Trinity opposes this motion.
I think we have possibly some people who would like to speak from the floor. So I would like to open this part of the debate. First, all proposition, Angus O'Connor.
Okay, so I'd just like to preface what I'm saying is that I've been harangued into doing this. I think the opposition have given an excellent demonstration of why being in the euro makes economic sense. But the reason I want to propose this motion is quite different, ladies and gentlemen. It's precisely because that we would be exposed to currency attack. It's precisely because the fall of our nation would likely ensue if we weren't in the euro that I think that we should propose this motion tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Because 2009 has been an interesting year. We've had the economic crisis, we've had the church scandals, we've had the floods, ladies and gentlemen. All we need now is a plague of locusts. And the thing is, ladies and gentlemen, we're on our first republic. The French are on their fifth. I think it's time for some reform, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's time for revolution. And it's only when the people come marching through the streets, praying for the blood of Brian Cowan and co, and we get rid of this corrupt political establishment, that we will get that revolution. And we won't get it as long as the stupid bloody euro is propping it up, ladies and gentlemen. And another thing. Does anyone remember the old Irish pounds? Weren't they really nice to look at? Weren't they kind of artsy and fun? Now, you know, the average fiver you get, everything is, you know, sellotaped together and it's dirty and you know, not printed well and it smells and, you know, I just kind of have a bit of nostalgia, a bit of 80s and 90s nostalgia for the good old Irish currency with James Joyce and the stag on the Irish pound and all that kind of stuff. And I'd like to see it come back. But on a serious note, getting back to the revolution part. How long am I supposed to speak for? Oh shit, I really should have prepared some notes. Right, okay. So, on a serious note, I really do think it's time that we actually reassessed where we're coming from in this debate. And looked at what's really important, that it has nothing to do with the economics, that literally, that these guys are so right. As in, we are the most indebted country in the world. If you include people's personal leverage in terms of credit cards, we are like 800% of our GDP indebted, right? We're more indebted than Iceland, ladies and gentlemen, right? The problem with the euro and the problem with the ECB is that actually creates a situation of moral hazard, right? Where we have a situation where we know as a society and as a government that there is this external amorphous entity that is headed up by Jean-Claude Trichet, the central bank, that will actually bail us out, that will allow us to a certain extent to, borrow so we can stimulate our economy to the tune of 15% of our GDP. And the problem with that is basically, it makes us more likely to bring ourselves to the situation where we are going to actually get ourselves into this type of trouble. The problem with insurance, for example, the whole idea behind moral hazard, for those of you who aren't economists, is that once you insure somebody against a probability, they actually have an incentive to actually bring that probability about, because then they get the insurance, right? So essentially what the Irish government has been doing, as Kieran so eloquently said, has been on a big, massive drinking binge fueled by cheap credit and housing, ladies and gentlemen. And it was able to do that partially because it knew that because we're in the European currency, because the euro can't tolerate one of its member states going under, that there is always that safeguard there of the European Central Bank to actually bail us out. And I think our politicians have demonstrably shown that they are not competent to actually dictate fiscal and financial and monetary policy in the event that they will be bailed out by other people. I think we have to have a situation basically where you've got like the Irish government as the uninsured driver driving down a country boreen who's going at about 10 miles an hour purely because he knows that if he hits anyone he's fucked. But as long as he's got full comprehensive insurance, we're in a dangerous situation. And for those reasons, I'm proud to stand in proposition.
Impromptu against the motion, Barry Cahill.
Step 5 aims at Kieran for using unparliamentary language in the debating chamber, so that's 4 times the subscription.
20 quid.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen. While Angus said he was harangued, I feel I was kind of harangued until I heard that debate. I think the Eurozone is pretty deadly. The proposition, largely what they gave us, was isn't it really difficult to deal with a recession when you're tied by these interest rates that aren't in conjunction with yours? What I'm going to talk about here, just really briefly, is I'm going to give Cambridge these benefits that they wanted to hear. Sorry, it's a bit late. Apologies. Thank God the judges are gone, lads. But crucially, how being in the Eurozone actually particularly makes us more able to deal with this recession and get back on track. Because the last thing Cambridge said was, isn't unemployment in Ireland going up at like a massive rate? Well, let's look at what caused the global financial crisis. It was largely what was going on in those unregulated capital markets over in London. It's also one of those things that's being redressed over in Europe under the Lisbon Treaty, with more stringent controls on capital entry and exit into the European Union under Articles 2, 12, and 164. Now, onto this idea of job creation. Because Mary gave us this idea that, pizza is really expensive over here, and it's really cheap over there. So, she could set up this nice little business importing and exporting. But what she's forgotten is that there's kind of this really big benefit to being in the biggest currency in the world. And that's currency security. Knowing that if you move that pizza from England to Scotland, you can be pretty safe in the knowledge that it will still be worth, the currency will still be worth the same when you get there. But the thing is, when you export things, sometimes the currency changes in the time it takes to move that. The kind of currency security that comes with being in the largest currency of the world means that it's a better business environment for people to actually take those risks. It minimizes risks and creates jobs. That's really simple. That's a benefit of the Eurozone. She said that the Asian markets are great as well. You know, why do we need to focus on the European Union? Well, first of all, I'd say, you know, the carbon crimes involved with exporting all our stuff over there and back is pretty problematic. But also, I mean, like we are in the euro. It's a really close market to export to, and also they're called emerging markets, which is just kind of a nice way to put occasionally dodgy markets. We think that there is a huge value to the kind of stability that comes with the biggest currency in the world. Now, secondly, this is the second thing I want to talk about. It's kind of, I feel kind of sorry for Britain whenever they talk about the European Union. Because I think they have been kind of harshly treated by the European Union throughout history. Prior to them joining, the rules were almost vindictively adjusted to almost intentionally screw the Brits in the way that revenue was collected. And then there's also a lot of the facts that the Eurozone does disproportionately affect the Brits. Things like in Britain, they have one of the highest rates in Europe of mortgages. Per capita. So yeah, they are more vulnerable to interest rates. We are kind of affected by that in the same way, but the majority of those continentals over there don't have the same kind of thing. There's also this idea that they gave us that you know, you need to be able to have this big Keynesian fiscal stimulus. We say that like one of the first things you learn in Leaving Cert Irish geography is that Ireland is a small, open economy. We say there's a huge problem of leakages because we like things like, I don't know, flat screen TVs and that sort of thing. So when you do pump a load of money in, you don't exactly get a huge value for money. So you end up servicing a larger national debt, which is problematic. And it's something Barra talked about when he said that throwing a currency crisis into the mix means you have more of a national debt to service. I'm just going to wrap that up there because it just got bad.
I can understand that because obviously they have a lot to talk about and a fine balance to judge. The disadvantage of that is that you get to listen to me for a few minutes. I was in the Doyle Bar at about 6 o'clock this evening, which is a good place to drink. I recommend it. And I got a telephone call from your auditor who said, sorry, this is a bit last minute, but how do you fancy coming along and sharing a debate this evening? And I said, that would be delightful. Thank you very much. What's it on? And he told me the motion, and I said, yes, that's very interesting. I of course don't have to say anything, do I? No. So I turn up, and given this extensive notice, which I'm very grateful, I'm met by one of your colleagues and taken upstairs, and I meet the judges, and I say, right, so we're judging this. Excellent. There's been a change of plan, actually. You're in the chair, and you get to speak. Excellent. How on earth did you come to that conclusion? Well, unfortunately, Brian Lennon, who's going to do this, is not available. And we can't afford David Williams, so it's you. But it's genuinely a pleasure, and I'm genuinely flattered, thank you very much, to be here. I did think for a moment, why would they take the new British ambassador to chair a debating competition between a British and an Irish team? Surely there would be some suspicion of bias. But then I thought about it a little bit deeper and realised that indeed there may be some bias. After all, I'm brand new here, and as far as I'm aware, it's not really in my medium-term interest to antagonise Trinity. And somebody very cleverly read my CV and discovered that actually I went to Oxford. nevertheless to be impartial. I'm not going to speak on the subject because I'm not going to speak on the subject. But I will say two things, two semi-serious things. The first is that however you come down on this motion, whatever you think about some of the frankly inflammatory rhetoric and inflammatory history that's been blown around our two countries are intimately intertwined. They are intimately intertwined culturally, and we forgive you, Jesuit friends. We are intimately intertwined in terms of personal history, and we are economically intertwined still. The figures, which are known, I'm sure, to all of you, are really quite striking. The two-way trade has gone down a little bit this year, but the UK still trades as much with Ireland as we do with France, with 15 times the population. And Ireland still trades as much with the UK as it does with France, Italy, Germany combined. Indeed, it trades as much with the UK as it does with Brazil, India, China, Russia, 4 times over. So the interlinking is very, very real. Whatever way you come down with this, I didn't forget that. The other thing to remember is that our two countries, whatever you think about this motion, are sovereign partner nations in the European Union. And as partners in the European Union, we have a tremendous amount that we need to do together. And we face some really serious common challenges, whether it is climate and the events in this country and in Cumbria have brought home to us, I think, quite how much that is a real challenge as well as a distant challenge. Climate, energy, or the environment, or a range of other subjects, we are, I hope, and will remain, two very close partner nations. Thank you very much. Judges have joined us again, but before we go back to the judges, it's being too late now to sway their expert opinion during their deliberations. I do need to put this motion to the House. The motion before us being, this House believes that Ireland should never have joined the Eurozone. Can all those in favour of the motion please say aye?
Aye.
You can feel the tension. All those against say nay.
Nay!
It's tough.
We should have a sing-off.
Unfortunately, the judges now step in. Thank you, everybody.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. And I should make the point that it's a short 27 years since I last debated in this chamber. And I remember representing the philosopher from UCC coming up here, which was always great fun, taking on Trinity. And I remember being in great form getting off the train at Euston. I remember being in great form getting back on the train at Euston. But I don't remember an awful lot in between. Other than there were quite a few people who stood up and stood down and waved their hands around quite a lot. And I have no idea what the motion was we debated that particular night. But I'm sure that all of you will remember the motion that has been debated tonight, because the quality of debating here has been exceptional. I think we're blessed that universities on both sides of the Irish Sea offer world-class debating to the people who participate in it and the people who listen and absorb it. And it's one of the great things that exist in universities in Britain and Ireland. It's something that should be nurtured, supported and encouraged. And it's great to see that 27 years later it still is ranking at such a high level as we've seen here tonight. In relation to a couple of points that my colleagues and I would observe on in relation to the debate, certain parts of the economic analysis were patchy. We found that some of the research was not as structured and as in-depth as it should have been, and there could have been more background detail in terms and understanding of what the key drivers of what's actually going on in the Irish economy and in the UK economy at the moment in the contributions. We also thought that the pace of some of the contributors were too quick. that being at this standard where you're working in this type of an environment, you should appreciate and understand that the clock is there to guide you, it's not there to drive you. You're not working to the clock, you're working to an audience that's around you. And getting caught up in very quick-paced utterances tends to lose your message and tends to make it difficult for your audience to absorb an awful lot of facts, and we had an awful lot of facts here tonight. In coming to our judgment, we believe that the team that persevered here combined very successfully a whole load of humour, energy, and very good analysis of what actually is happening in this particular point. We found that it was very difficult for one team to put forward their arguments around the motion because there probably is a great difficulty in building an argument around one side of the motion. And for that, and to their credit, they put a huge amount of effort and resource in. The other point I would like to make is that the gender balance in debating is still woefully inappropriate. 27 years after I debated when it was dominated entirely by men, it continues to be dominated entirely by men. And that is something that all of you have a role in correcting. But it is ridiculous that the percentage of women represented in debating teams in universities in Britain and Ireland is still the same as it was 25 years ago. So in conclusion, in relation to our judgments as to the awards for tonight's prizes, we find that the Trinity team has won the team debate. And the winner of the individual debate, which has nothing to do, and I underline that in relation to my comments on gender, is Mary Nugent.
Thank you to the judges for that. Before I call on your auditor to wrap things up, I just need to call upon your general manager to say a few things.
Good evening, everybody. I just want to make a couple of words from the Student Economic Review. First of all, thank you very much to Cambridge for coming all the way across the Irish Sea to join us this evening and for keeping us entertained. We really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And then I know that my editor, Jason, will shoot me if I don't let you know that we are now accepting submissions for the Economic Review. For more information, you can find out details on how to apply on our website, which is just tcd.ie/economics/SER. And just in continuing with that, we're holding a workshop next Tuesday at 7 p.m. in the Emmett Theatre, just on how to write a good essay. And if anyone is considering sitting the exams, the SCOL exams in January, it's definitely a good idea to just come along just to know how to structure a good essay. I'd also like to just take this opportunity to thank Dr. Michael Wycherley, Dr. Carol Newman, and especially our president, Professor O'Hagan, without whose generous contribution, generous support, and dedication to his students, we really wouldn't be here without you. So thank you very much. And finally, to our sponsors, first of all, the European Commission representation in Ireland, who are very kindly supporting our reception upstairs afterwards, which you're very all welcome to attend to. And then our sponsors, Harry Hartford, Alistair Musgrave, the IIIS, Frontier Economics, and the ESRI, and especially Mr. Vinay Nair, who, without his contribution, these debates really wouldn't be able to take place. And he was actually the debates convener on the Student Economic Review a few years back. And in honor of that, we'd like to present for the first time the Vinay Nair Cup to the best individual speaker, which this year was me.
Firstly, I'd just like to thank the judges because this debate never would have taken place in the way it did without them. I'd also like to thank the chair, His Excellency Julian King, for chairing the debate. Tricia Collette in the Economics Department. I suppose the speakers too deserve a thank you as well for putting on a performance for us. So thanks to everybody for coming. And the European Commission representation in Ireland actually had quite a lavish reception upstairs with canapes, wine and stuff like that. So we thank them for it. So with that, I'll leave it to the chair to adjourn the meeting.
The meeting is now adjourned.
Expecting to do all of that.
Vintage performance.
Absolutely. Like